The auction hall buzzed with a strange energy, an electrifying mixture of greed, fascination, and wonder. The crowd was packed in tight, all eyes fixed on the stage as a heavy curtain was pulled back. The collective breath of the audience seemed to freeze in midair. At the center of it all, a massive cage sat, its iron bars thick enough to resist almost any attack. Inside, a creature writhed in pain. Its once mighty wings were tattered, a faint pulse of purple light glowing weakly beneath the translucent scales. A dragon, one of the last of its kind. It was dying, and the audience knew it. "I bid 20,000, someone called from the front. The voice was crisp and confident, cutting through the tension in the room. Others quickly followed with their offers, each bid higher than the last, a testament to the creature's rarity. But no one knew what they were truly bidding on. No one knew the price they'd pay. Luke Marshall, standing at the back, was different. He wasn't here for profit or status. The old auctioneer's voice boomed, droning out about the dragon's supposed healing properties. But Luke's gaze never left the creature. There was something in its eyes, something that screamed for help. He could see the desperation. 500,000. The voice broke through Luke's thoughts. Luke hesitated for a moment before raising his hand. 1 million, he said, his voice quiet but firm. The room went still. A hush descended as people turned to look at the lone bidder at the back of the room. His pulse quickened. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed. "A bold move, sir. 1 million. Going once, going twice. Sold." The gavel slammed down, echoing through the hall. The auctioneer's words were a blur to Luke as he stood, staring at the wounded dragon. He didn't understand why he had bid so high. He didn't even have that much money. But something about the creature, helpless and broken, called out to him. Something deep inside him had shifted the moment he'd seen those eyes. Luke didn't look at the other bidders. His focus was solely on the dragon now. He could feel the weight of the situation, the lives of everyone in the room hanging on what happened next. As the handlers moved to transport the dragon, Luke stepped forward. His heart pounded in his chest. "Can I see it closer?" The handlers sneered at him. "Do you have a permit? These beasts aren't for just anyone." "I'll take full responsibility," Luke replied, his voice a little more forceful than he intended. The handler sized him up, then nodded. He didn't care, as long as Luke paid the price. Luke stepped closer, the dragon's breathing shallow and erratic. It was a massive creature, its body adorned with intricate scales that shimmered faintly, despite the damage. Its once proud horns were cracked, its wings broken and bent at unnatural angles. Yet, even in its pain, there was a beauty to it. A primal elegance. It was a force of nature, and it was being sold off like livestock. The dragon's eyes locked with Luke's. They were a swirling mixture of purple and gold, like two galaxies colliding. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. "I'll take you with me," Luke whispered, almost to himself. The dragon didn't respond, but in that moment, something between them clicked. The ride back to his apartment was quiet, save for the occasional grunt of pain from the dragon. Luke had managed to arrange a secure transport, and the creature was carefully strapped down, its wounds tended to with temporary healing salves, though not nearly enough. Luke's mind raced. Why had he done it? What had possessed him to throw away everything he had just to save a creature that most would consider a threat? He wasn't sure. He only knew that he couldn't just leave it there, to be auctioned off like some kind of object. As they reached the small rooftop garage of his apartment, Luke opened the back of the van. The dragon was barely conscious, its head resting on the cold floor, eyes still dim, yet somehow watching him. He was going to get answers, he told himself. He didn't care if it was crazy. Something told him that this was the start of something bigger. The dragon stirred as Luke carefully approached, its mouth barely opening. "You saved me," it rasped, its voice barely more than a whisper. The words sent a shiver down Luke's spine. Luke swallowed hard. "What? What's your name?" The dragon's eyes flickered with a strange mix of recognition and confusion. It spoke again, slowly. I am Zyron. And you? You have no idea what you've unleashed. A chill ran through Luke. He hadn't known what he was getting into. But he was about to find out, whether he was ready or not. The sun had barely begun to rise over the city when Luke finally made it back to his apartment. The towering building loomed before him, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the faint glow of the morning sky. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all centered around the dragon he had rescued, and the strange, cryptic words it had whispered to him, "You have no idea what you've unleashed." As the elevator hummed its way up, Luke's pulse quickened. What did Zyron mean? What kind of creature had he just brought into his life? The weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. The last few hours felt like a blur, but one thing was clear: the dragon had been right. He didn't know what he had gotten into. When the elevator doors opened, Luke was greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and old books, his apartment a sanctuary of comfort. But today, it felt different. The room seemed too small, too claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in around him. He moved toward the makeshift bed where Zyron lay. The dragon's form was barely visible beneath the blanket of cloth Luke had hastily thrown over it. Its chest rose and fell slowly, shallow breaths rasping from its mouth. The creature's broken wings twitched now and then, a subtle sign that it was still alive, though clearly struggling. Luke knelt beside it, his fingers brushing the dragon's scales. They were cooler than before, and he could feel the faint hum of energy beneath them. He had no idea how to help it, no real understanding of what this creature was beyond its obvious otherworldliness. The dragon's eyes fluttered open, their shimmering, otherworldly glow still dim, but unmistakably alive. Luke's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with it once more. "I did what I had to," Luke said softly, his voice a little shaky. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Zyron's eyes narrowed slightly, the ancient intelligence behind them sparking to life. "Safe," the dragon rasped. "You have no idea what danger you've invited into your home, human." Luke's brow furrowed, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I'm not afraid of you, Zyron. I'm trying to help." The dragon shifted slightly, its wounded body groaning with the movement. It stared at Luke for a long moment, studying him in a way that felt almost calculating. "You think I need your help?" Zyron's voice was strained but laced with amusement. "I've survived for centuries, mortal. I don't need your pity." "I didn't think of it as pity," Luke replied, his voice firming. "I saw something in you. I couldn't just leave you there to die." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Zyron's wings twitched again, the broken bones beneath them cracking as if protesting the movement. It let out a low growl, then closed its eyes. "You've made a mistake, human," it whispered, barely audible. "The war is coming. And you're standing right in its path." The words hit Luke like a punch to the gut. "War?" He swallowed hard. "What do you mean by that? What war?" Zyron's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but the hardness returned quickly, its voice dropping to a whisper of warning. "You've chosen a side you cannot undo, and now, both you and your planet will pay the price." Luke felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His mind raced. What had he done? What had he unleashed by bringing this creature into his life? Before he could respond, Zyron stirred again, its powerful body shifting beneath the cloth. The dragon's eyes narrowed, fixating on something beyond the walls of the apartment. Luke followed its gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it?" Luke asked, his voice low, his senses alert. Zyron's breathing quickened. "They've found me. It won't be long before they come for you, too." Panic surged in Luke's chest. "Who?" "The hunters. The ones who track down my kind. They won't stop until they've taken me back." "And you," Zyron paused, as though considering whether to say more. "You're in this whether you like it or not." Luke stood, feeling the weight of the dragon's warning settle over him like a dark cloud. The realization hit him, he had just become part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just a bystander. he was tangled in a fight that stretched beyond the reaches of Earth. And now, he had a choice to make, to help the dragon and fight whatever forces were coming, or to walk away, leaving the creature to its fate. But there was no walking away now. A sharp rattle from the window broke his thoughts, followed by the faintest sound of wings, a dark silhouette gliding through the early morning sky. "They're here," Zyron said, its voice low and full of dread. "Get ready." Luke's heart pounded in his chest as he moved instinctively toward the door. Whatever this war was, it had just begun. The chill of the morning air stung Luke's skin as he moved quickly across his apartment, his mind reeling from the dragon's ominous warning. His eyes darted to the window, the faintest glimpse of dark shapes moving against the cloud-covered sky confirming what Zyron had said. The hunters had arrived. Zyron's breathing had become shallow, the dragon's condition worsening by the minute. Luke knelt beside it, his heart racing. The creature's body was still fragile, its wings broken and its energy low. But there was something in its eyes now, a sense of urgency and fear that hadn't been there before. "We don't have much time," Zyron rasped, the words barely more than a growl. "You need to get me out of here. They'll burn this place to the ground if they have to." Luke's hands clenched into fists. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get Zyron to safety, but there was no clear way out. The city was a labyrinth of towering buildings and dark alleyways, the streets a chaotic mess of vehicles and people. If the hunters were already here, he was certain they would be watching every exit. "What are we up against?" Luke asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He needed more information. Zyron's eyes flickered with recognition as it struggled to sit up, its wings trembling. "They are relentless. Shadow hunters, born from the dark corners of the galaxy. They track my kind with a ferocity you cannot imagine. They won't stop until I'm dead or captured. And once they have me, they'll turn their attention to you. You're already marked, human." Luke's mind raced, trying to process everything. He wasn't ready for this, wasn't prepared for a battle like the one Zyron was describing. And yet, something in him, some primal instinct he hadn't known he possessed, refused to back down. He couldn't let these creatures hurt Zyron. Not after everything he had risked to keep it alive. "I won't let them take you," Luke said firmly. He stood up, scanning the room. His eyes fell on the small window across from him, a potential escape route. It wasn't much, but it was something. Zyron's deep, rumbling voice broke through his thoughts. "There's no escape, human. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Luke turned back to the dragon, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Then teach me." There was a long silence as Zyron looked at him, as though measuring him for the first time. Finally, it spoke. "You're not a fighter," Zyron said quietly, almost with a touch of sadness. "You can't win this." "I'm not trying to win," Luke shot back. "I'm trying to survive." Zyron's eyes glowed faintly as it processed Luke's words. "Then you need to understand what you've done. These hunters, they're not like anything you've faced before. They move in shadows. They can blend into any surface, any object. You won't see them until they're already upon you." Luke's stomach tightened. He glanced at the window again, his eyes scanning the city below. The street was busy, but it felt empty somehow, too quiet, too still. A gut feeling gnawed at him, a warning that something was about to go horribly wrong. A soft sound reached his ears. The faintest scrape of metal against metal, barely perceptible over the rush of his pulse. But it was enough. Luke's heart leapt in his chest as the hair on the back of his neck stood up. "They're here," Zyron muttered under its breath. Luke moved without thinking. He rushed to the small desk near the wall, grabbing the nearest object, a metal rod, and turned back to the dragon. "Can you walk?" Zyron's wings fluttered weakly. "Barely." "You're going to have to," Luke said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "Come on, we're getting out of here." With surprising strength, Luke helped Zyron to its feet, the dragon's massive form unsteady as it struggled to remain upright. Every movement seemed to cost it energy, but the determination in Zyron's eyes burned brighter than ever. The quiet scrape grew louder, more distinct, and Luke's gaze shot toward the door. He could see the faint outline of movement on the other side, shadowy figures shifting in and out of view. His breath caught in his throat. "They're already inside," Zyron said. "Run." Without a second thought, Luke grabbed Zyron's arm and pulled the dragon toward the window. He had no plan, no backup, only the instinct to escape. But just as he reached the window, a sound like cracking glass shattered the tense silence. Something heavy slammed into the door, sending it flying off its hinges. The first hunter appeared, dark, cloaked, and silent, with glowing eyes that fixed on Luke like a predator sending its prey. Luke's pulse thundered in his ears as he looked at the dragon. There was no turning back now. "We fight," Luke said, barely above a whisper. Zyron's voice was low, filled with urgency. "We fight, or we die." The room filled with the heavy sound of footsteps. The first hunter was just steps away, and Luke knew that time was running out. But one thing was certain, the war had just begun. The weight of the moment pressed down on Luke's chest, his every breath shallow and tight. The cloaked hunter stood before him, its presence an unnerving black void against the faint light of the room. Its glowing eyes never wavered, locked onto Luke with terrifying intensity. Zyron's breath came in ragged gasps, its massive form barely supported by its weakened legs. The dragon's wings twitched, but they weren't ready to carry it yet. Luke turned to the creature, its once proud posture now bent and broken, and his resolve solidified. "We don't have much time," Luke muttered to himself. His hand tightened around the metal rod he had grabbed earlier. The weapon felt like a child's toy in comparison to what they were facing. But there was nothing else. "Stay behind me," Luke ordered, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his veins. "I'll handle this." Zyron's eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop them? You think your strength will win this battle?" Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the hunter. The figure remained still, its face obscured beneath its dark hood, but Luke could feel the weight of its gaze. It was as if the air itself had thickened, waiting for the clash that was about to unfold. "You won't get away," the hunter's voice rasped, unnatural and cold. It sounded like a whisper and a scream at once, an echo of a threat. Luke's heart pounded. "I won't let you harm Zyron. Not while I'm still standing." There was no response, no more taunts. The hunter's form seemed to shift, its edges blurring as if it were one with the shadows, its dark cloak flowing like smoke. Luke's stomach twisted in dread. Suddenly, the hunter lunged. The speed was terrifying, the motion fluid and almost invisible, but Luke was ready. He swung the rod with every ounce of strength he had, slamming it into the side of the hunter's head. The impact rattled his bones, but the creature didn't stagger. Instead, it twisted, its body bending unnaturally as it slashed out with inhuman speed, forcing Luke to duck and roll to the side. The hunter's claws slashed through the air just inches from his face. Luke's heart nearly stopped, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He scrambled to his feet, eyes wild as he searched for a way to gain an advantage. "You're fast," Luke panted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But I'm not done yet." The hunter didn't respond, its dark form already shifting again, moving through the room with a terrifying fluidity that made it seem as though it were a shadow itself. Luke's grip tightened on the rod, his thoughts racing. A sudden movement caught his eye. Zyron's wings were trembling, and the dragon was struggling to gather energy. The dragon's once feared power was now barely a whisper, and Luke felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on his shoulders. He had to protect both of them. "Zyron!" Luke shouted, his voice raw. "I need you." The dragon's head lifted, and for a moment, it looked as though Zyron would collapse under its own weight. But then, its eyes flared with a fierce light. "Don't think this will be easy, human. I'll help, but we're running out of time." "They're relentless." Luke nodded, still keeping his eyes trained on the hunter. "We don't have time for anything else." The hunter seemed to pause, perhaps studying them, and then the air around it shifted again. It launched itself toward Luke with terrifying force, but this time, Luke was ready. He sidestepped, swinging the rod with precision, the metal making a sickening thud as it connected with the hunter's shoulder. The hunter shrieked, a sound that scraped against Luke's mind like nails on glass. But it didn't retreat. It only got angrier, more vicious. The claws came for him again, slashing with such speed that it was impossible to track them. Luke managed another strike, but his arms were shaking from the effort. Sweat dripped down his face, his muscles aching with the strain. He couldn't keep this up much longer. They needed a plan. "Zyron!" Luke cried, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, now!" With a deafening roar, Zyron surged forward, its wings spreading wide despite the broken bones. A burst of energy rippled through the room, shaking the very walls. The hunter staggered, momentarily thrown off balance. But it quickly regained its composure, swiping at Zyron's weakened form. Luke didn't wait for a second invitation. He dashed forward, swinging the rod with everything he had. This time, it connected with the hunter's side with a sickening crack. The creature's body lurched, its eyes flashing with rage. It wasn't enough. The hunter let out a low growl, moving faster than Luke could track. And then, in a blur of motion, it was on him. It swiped across his chest, sending him crashing to the ground with a violent force. Pain exploded in his side, and he struggled to breathe, unable to move for a moment. Zyron let out a howl of fury, pushing forward despite its own injuries. But the hunter was relentless. Luke's vision swam, his body trembling, but he didn't have time to stop. His hand groped for the rod, the cold metal still within his grasp. "You won't win," he gritted through his teeth. The battle had only just begun.